I thought I was teaching my husband a lesson about evolutionary biology and realistic expectations. But why did my ex's wife show up at our favorite coffee shop with printouts I had never seen? I never imagined that proving my theory would cost me my marriage, my reputation, and the man I thought would always choose me over honesty. My name is Eudora Finch, and I am 34 years old, working as a marketing copywriter for a mid-sized tourism agency in a city where everyone seems to believe that ambition and intelligence should be tempered with traditional values and outdated relationship structures that I have long considered intellectually dishonest and limiting. I have always prided myself on my ability to see through social constructs that most people accept without question, and I have spent the past several years developing what I consider to be a more evolved understanding of human relationships, one based on evolutionary biology and the recognition that monogamy is not a natural state, but rather a system of control that serves outdated economic and religious, rather than genuine human happiness or emotional fulfillment. My husband Miles is an operations analyst for a supply chain company, a steady and methodical man who has always supported my career and respected my independence, though I have increasingly felt that his worldview is limited by conventional thinking and an unwillingness to engage with the kinds of complex philosophical questions that I find essential to living an examined and authentic life. On a Wednesday afternoon in early March, I arranged to meet Declan Reeve at the charging station alcove of a trendy co-working space downtown, a location I had been using for several weeks as a neutral spot where we could work on what I had described to Miles as a collaborative video project that required access to specialized editing software and a quiet environment away from the distractions of home. Declan is my ex-boyfriend from college, someone I dated seriously for nearly 2 years before we drifted apart due to geographic distance and different career trajectories. And when we reconnected at a professional networking event 6 months ago, I was struck by how much we still had in common intellectually, how easily our conversations flowed into discussions about philosophy and psychology and the ways that modern society imposes artificial limitations on human behavior in the name of stability and tradition. The co-working space was bustling with freelancers and remote workers, and the charging station alcove where we sat was partially shielded by a row of potted plants that created a sense of privacy while still keeping us visible enough that the meetings felt professional and innocent, and I found the atmosphere conducive to the kind of deep conversation that I rarely had with Miles anymore. Conversations that challenged assumptions and explored ideas rather than simply managing logistics and discussing household responsibilities. Declan leaned close to show me some footage he had been editing on his tablet, and I felt a thrill of intellectual connection as we discussed the narrative structure and the way certain documentary techniques could be used to challenge viewer assumptions. And the hum of conversation around us felt like a comfortable backdrop to something that I told myself was purely creative and professional, even as I recognized that the frequency and intensity of our meetings had begun to shift into territory that might look questionable to someone who did not understand the difference between emotional intimacy and intellectual collaboration. After our session ended, I drove home feeling energized and validated in a way that my interactions with Miles had stopped providing. And I decided to post a carefully worded status update on social media about how mature adults understand that love does not require ownership and that healthy relationships are built on trust and freedom rather than possessiveness and insecurity. The post received immediate engagement from my friend circle, with several people leaving supportive comments about the importance of maintaining independence within partnerships, and I saved the positive feedback as confirmation that my perspective was not only reasonable, but actually more evolved than the conventional relationship model that most people accept without critical examination. That evening, when I arrived home, Miles was sitting at the desk in our home office, reviewing something on his laptop, and the soft glow from the screen illuminated his face in a way that made him look tired and older than his 36 years. And when I greeted him casually and asked about his day, he responded with the kind of brief summary that had become typical of our conversations lately. Pleasant but lacking the depth or curiosity that I valued in my exchanges with Declan. Later, as I was getting ready for bed, Miles came into the bedroom and asked in a calm and measured tone if I had a moment to talk about something that had been on his mind, and I felt a flicker of annoyance because I could tell from his posture and his careful word choice that he was about to bring up some concern or complaint that I would have to address and manage, rather than simply enjoying the relaxed evening I had been looking forward to after a productive day. He asked me about our shared streaming account, specifically about a device that was logged in under the name Dee's iPad that he did not recognize and that had been accessing the account during hours when I had told him I was working alone on research projects, and he wanted to know whose device it was and why someone else was using our personal entertainment account without his knowledge or consent. I sighed and explained patiently that I had lent my login credentials to Declan because we were working on the collaborative video project and needed access to certain documentary series for reference footage and stylistic inspiration. And I told Miles that his concern about device logins seemed excessive and controlling, especially since I had been completely transparent about working with Declan and had never tried to hide the fact that we were meeting regularly to develop the project. I pointed out that people who are truly secure in their relationships do not feel threatened by their partners sharing streaming passwords with old friends, and I suggested that his focus on tracking who was watching what on a subscription service indicated a level of possessiveness and insecurity that was frankly concerning, and that he might want to examine why he felt the need to monitor my activities so closely. Miles listened without interrupting, which I initially took as a sign that he was considering my perspective. But when he finally responded, he said quietly that sharing personal account passwords with an ex-partner felt like a boundary issue to him, and he asked if I could understand why that might make him uncomfortable given the history between Declan and me, and the fact that I had been spending significant time with him without providing much detail about what the project actually involved or when it might be completed. I felt my irritation rising at what I perceived as his attempt to police my friendships and creative collaborations, and I told him in no uncertain terms that I did not owe him a minute-by-minute accounting of my creative process or my professional relationships, and that his fixation on logistics and timelines was exactly the kind of rigid, unimaginative thinking that prevented people from engaging in meaningful intellectual work and authentic human connection. I reminded him that I had always been honest and transparent about my activities, and that if he trusted me as a partner, he would not be questioning my decisions about who I chose to work with or what resources I chose to share with collaborators who were contributing to my professional development. Miles nodded slowly, his expression unreadable, and then he said simply that he would think about what I had said, and he left the bedroom without pressing the issue further, which left me feeling both vindicated that I had successfully defended my boundaries and vaguely unsettled by the calm, detached way he had accepted my explanation without the kind of emotional reaction or further argument that I had been prepared to counter. In the days following our conversation about the streaming account, I made a conscious decision to continue my meetings with Declan without adjusting my schedule or providing Miles with the detailed explanations that he seemed to want, because I believed firmly that giving in to his need for constant updates and reassurance would only reinforce the possessive dynamic that I was trying to move us beyond. And I felt that the healthiest approach was to model the kind of trust and independence that I wanted our relationship to embody, even if Miles was not yet intellectually prepared to embrace that level of evolved partnership. On a Thursday afternoon in late March, Declan and I met at a hotel in a business district about 30 miles from our neighborhood, a location we had chosen because it offered quiet meeting rooms that could be rented by the hour for professional consultations and creative sessions, and the privacy allowed us to work without the ambient noise and interruptions that made the co-working space less ideal for the more intensive editing work we were doing on the video project. We met in the corridor outside room 412, and I remember the hum of the ice machine filling the space between us as Declan handed me the keycard and made a joke about how strange it felt to be meeting in a hotel for work purposes, though we both understood that the arrangement made practical sense given our need for uninterrupted focus time and access to the large monitor and editing equipment that Declan had brought along in his equipment case. The session lasted approximately 3 hours, during which we reviewed footage, discussed narrative arc, and debated the philosophical implications of the documentary style we were attempting to create. And I felt the same intellectual exhilaration that had initially drawn me back into regular contact with Declan. The sense that I was engaging with someone who could match my analytical depth and who did not need every complex idea translated into simpler terms or reassurances that the conversation was not threatening to our relationship. When the session ended and I drove home that evening, I paid for the room rental with cash that I had withdrawn earlier in the week, but the hotel automatically generated a receipt that was tucked into the keycard sleeve. And when I transferred items from my work bag to my purse later that night, the small slip of paper fell into the crack beside the center console of my car, and I did not notice it because my mind was already moving ahead to the social media post I wanted to write about the importance of intellectual partnership and the ways that creative collaboration can push people toward personal growth. 2 days later, Miles was searching for a charging cable in my car while I was inside getting ready for a morning meeting, and he found the torn receipt wedged beside the center console with the date, the hotel name, and the room number clearly printed on the thermal paper. And when I came outside and saw him holding it with a strange expression on his face, I felt a jolt of defensive anger rather than guilt, because I knew that the meeting had been entirely professional and that the only reason it might look questionable was because Miles was predisposed to interpret my actions through a lens of suspicion rather than trust. He asked me calmly why I had been at a hotel on a workday when my calendar had shown an all-day workshop at a downtown convention center, and he pointed out that the hotel was located 30 miles in the opposite direction from where I had said I would be, and he wanted to know what the room had been used for and why I had not mentioned the change in plans when I came home that evening. I immediately challenged him for going through my belongings without permission, and I told him that finding a receipt in my car and interrogating me about it was a violation of my privacy and a sign of deeply controlling behavior that I found unacceptable in a partnership between equals. I explained that the receipt must have been from an old work trip that I had forgotten to mention, or possibly from a meeting location that I had confused with another event, and I said that his insistence on tracking my movements with forensic precision was proof that he had fundamental trust issues that were damaging our relationship far more than any scheduling discrepancy ever could. Miles listened without interrupting, and then he asked a specific question about why the receipt showed a check-in time of 2 in the afternoon if the workshop I had mentioned started at 9 in the morning, and he noted that the room number suggested an extended booking rather than a brief meeting, and he wondered if I could help him understand the timeline because he was genuinely confused about how the pieces fit together. I felt my frustration building at his persistence, and I told him that I did not remember every single detail of every single day, and that his obsession with timestamps and locations was the behavior of someone who was more interested in building a case against me than in actually communicating with me as a partner. And I accused him of treating our marriage like some kind of investigation rather than a relationship built on mutual respect and emotional maturity. I suggested that if he could not trust my word over a piece of paper that might not even be from the date he thought it was, then we had much bigger problems than a misplaced receipt, and I walked back into the house before he could ask any more questions, leaving him standing beside my car with the torn paper still in his hand and an expression on his face that I could not quite read, but that unsettled me more than I wanted to admit even to myself. The rooftop bar event took place on a Friday evening in mid-April, organised by our agency to celebrate the successful completion of a major campaign that had brought in several new clients and exceeded our quarterly revenue targets. And the venue was an upscale space with panoramic views of the city skyline, where colleagues and clients mingled under strings of ambient lighting while servers circulated with wine and small plates of appetizers. I had invited Declan to attend as my guest since the event was open to +1s and creative collaborators, and I had framed his attendance to Miles as a networking opportunity that would benefit both my professional reputation and the video project we were still ostensibly working on together, though Miles had declined to come himself, saying that he had work to catch up on and that he preferred to let me enjoy the evening without feeling obligated to introduce him to people he did not know. Julian Sato, one of my senior colleagues and someone I considered a friend, was standing near the appetizer table talking with a group of account managers when I arrived with Declan, and I noticed Julian glance toward us with an expression that seemed curious but not disapproving, and I felt confident that bringing Declan to a professional event would help normalize our collaboration in the eyes of people who might otherwise misinterpret the amount of time we were spending together. The evening progressed pleasantly, with conversations flowing easily between discussions of industry trends and lighter social topics, and I found myself enjoying the opportunity to introduce Declan to colleagues who appreciated his insights about visual storytelling and digital media. And I felt validated by the way people responded positively to his ideas and seemed to understand why I valued our creative partnership so highly. At one point, a colleague from the creative department asked me how I managed to balance intensive creative work with maintaining a stable home life, and the question felt like an invitation to articulate some of the philosophical principles I had been thinking about for months. And I responded by saying that my husband was a wonderful and supportive person, but that he did not quite grasp the intellectual freedom required for real artistic collaboration, which was why I valued working with people like Declan, who understood the importance of pushing beyond conventional boundaries and exploring ideas without the constraints of insecurity or possessiveness. Declan, who had been standing beside me with a glass of wine in his hand, smiled and added a comment about how some people are naturally wired for depth and complexity, while others prefer the comfort and predictability of surface-level interactions and routine domestic stability, and he delivered the observation with enough casual charm that several people in the circle chuckled politely, though I noticed that Julian's expression had shifted from amusement to something more guarded and uncomfortable. I felt a flush of satisfaction at having articulated my perspective so clearly in a public setting, and I interpreted the nervous laughter as evidence that I had challenged people to think more critically about their own relationship assumptions. And I posted a brief update on social media later that evening describing how refreshing it was to spend time with people who valued intellectual honesty and critical thinking over social conformity and emotional fragility. Julian approached me near the end of the evening as the crowd was beginning to thin, and he asked in a quiet voice if everything was okay at home, noting that some of the things I had said about Miles during the earlier conversation had sounded harsher than he thought I might have intended, and he wondered if I realized that several people had seemed uncomfortable with the comparison I had drawn between my husband and my creative collaborator. I felt a spike of defensive irritation at what I perceived as Julian's attempt to police my speech and tone, and I told him that I appreciated his concern but that I was simply being honest about the realities of my relationship, and that people who were truly secure would not feel threatened by a candid acknowledgement of different intellectual wavelengths and compatibility levels. Julian nodded slowly, but did not look entirely convinced, and he said quietly that he hoped I knew what I was doing, and then he excused himself to say goodbye to other guests, leaving me standing near the railing with Declan, who seemed amused by the interaction and suggested that some people were simply not ready to hear uncomfortable truths about the limitations of conventional marriage. When I arrived home later that night, Miles was still awake, sitting in the living room with his laptop closed on the coffee table beside him. And when I greeted him and began to describe the event in general terms, he asked me directly whether I had introduced Declan as my creative partner or as my guest, and whether I had said anything during the evening that might have given colleagues the impression that our marriage was struggling or that I valued my relationship with Declan more highly than my relationship with him. I felt my defenses rising immediately at what I interpreted as an accusation, and I told him that I had been perfectly appropriate in how I described our working relationship, and that if he was hearing reports that made him uncomfortable, it was probably because people were misinterpreting my words through their own conventional biases and assumptions. Miles said quietly that Julian had texted him to check in and to let him know that some of the things I had said at the event had concerned him, and he asked if I could help him understand why I felt the need to compare him unfavorably to Declan in front of my professional colleagues, and whether I understood how that kind of public commentary might affect both his reputation and our relationship. I accused him of being overly sensitive and of allowing Julian to manipulate him into feeling insecure about a few offhand comments that were meant to be playful and intellectually provocative rather than personally hurtful. And I told him that if he could not handle being around people who engaged in critical thinking and honest conversation, then perhaps he should examine why he felt so threatened by intellectual discourse and why he needed constant reassurance that he was valued despite his obvious limitations in abstract reasoning and philosophical flexibility. In the weeks following the rooftop bar incident, I became aware that Miles had begun to withdraw from our daily interactions in ways that felt deliberate and strategic rather than simply emotional. And while I initially interpreted his silence as sulking or passive-aggressive punishment for my refusal to apologize for speaking honestly about our intellectual incompatibility, I gradually began to notice that his detachment had a quality of calm finality that was different from the hurt feelings or temporary distance that had characterized our previous disagreements. He stopped asking questions about my schedule or my meetings with Declan, and when I volunteered information about my day or my work, he responded with brief acknowledgements that were polite but devoid of curiosity or engagement, and I found his lack of reaction more unsettling than the arguments and interrogations I had been prepared to defend against. I also noticed that he had begun organizing paperwork in the Home Office with unusual meticulousness, creating labeled folders and spreadsheets that he minimized quickly whenever I walked past his desk. And when I asked him what he was working on with such focused attention, he said simply that he was getting our financial records organized for tax purposes, and that he wanted to make sure all of our accounts and expenses were properly documented and separated into clear categories. What I did not know during those weeks in late April was that Miles had been contacted by a woman named Simone Reeve, who had introduced herself through our mutual friend Julian, and explained that she believed her husband Declan was involved in an affair, and that she had been gathering evidence over the past several weeks that seemed to point toward me as the other person involved in the relationship. Simone had discovered unusual charges on their shared credit card, including a payment to the Hotel Grand on the exact same date that appeared on the torn receipt Miles had found in my car. And she had also noticed that Declan's streaming account showed login activity from a device that did not belong to anyone in their household. And when she cross-referenced the times and locations with social media posts and calendar entries, she realized that the patterns matched the schedule I had been keeping with Declan under the pretense of our collaborative video project. Miles and Simone agreed to meet at a coffee shop in a neighborhood that was convenient for both of them, but far enough from our usual routines that the meeting would remain private, and they sat across from each other in a window booth on a Tuesday morning while the rest of the city went about its normal business, unaware that two betrayed spouses were about to compare evidence that would confirm suspicions neither of them had wanted to believe. Simone brought a folder containing printed credit card statements with highlighted charges, screenshots of text messages where Declan had mentioned meeting someone identified only as E for creative sessions, and a log of streaming account activity that showed simultaneous access from multiple devices during times when Declan had claimed to be working alone. And she laid the documents on the table between them with a methodical precision that matched Miles's own approach to documentation and record-keeping. Miles contributed his own evidence to the collection: the torn hotel receipt with room number 412 and the date clearly visible, screenshots of the streaming account showing the device labeled D's iPad, accessing the service during hours that corresponded exactly with the times I had told him I was doing solo research, printed copies of my social media posts describing our relationship as an experiment in evolved partnership and discussing the limitations of conventional monogamy, and a timeline he had created that cross-referenced my calendar entries labeled deep work with location data that showed I had been at the co-working space or the hotel rather than at the places I had claimed to be. When they compared their evidence side by side, the alignment was so perfect that it eliminated any remaining doubt about what had been happening. And Simone said quietly that she had thought she was losing her mind over the past few months because Declan had been so convincing in his explanations and so skilled at making her feel paranoid and controlling for questioning his schedule and his sudden need for privacy. And Miles nodded and said that Eudora had done the same thing to him, using intellectual arguments and philosophical frameworks to make him feel stupid and possessive for noticing obvious inconsistencies in her stories. The conversation shifted gradually from evidence review to emotional processing, and both of them admitted that discovering the truth felt both devastating and strangely relieving, because the gaslighting and manipulation had been so persistent and so sophisticated that having concrete proof finally validated their perceptions and allowed them to trust their own judgment again after months of being told they were imagining problems that did not exist. They exchanged contact information and agreed to meet again in a few days to discuss their next steps. And when they parted ways in the coffee shop parking lot, there was a moment of unexpected connection when Simone reached across the space between them and briefly touched Miles's hand in a gesture of solidarity and shared understanding. And he did not pull away because the simple human contact felt honest and grounding in a way that his interactions with me had not felt in months. Over the following 2 weeks, Miles and Simone met several more times, always in public spaces like parks or quiet cafes, and their conversations gradually expanded beyond evidence comparison to include discussions about how they were coping with the betrayal, what they valued in relationships, and what they hoped their lives might look like once they had moved past the immediate crisis. And a genuine friendship began to develop between them that was built on mutual respect, transparency, and the kind of emotional honesty that both of their marriages had been lacking. By early May, I had begun to notice that Miles's behavior had shifted into a pattern that felt more final and irreversible than anything I had experienced in our 8 years of marriage, and the change manifested not in dramatic confrontations or emotional outbursts, but rather in a kind of systematic detachment that touched every aspect of our shared domestic life, from the way he organized his belongings in separate spaces to the careful neutrality of his tone when we discussed household logistics or financial obligations. He had moved all of his clothing and personal items into the spare bedroom, claiming that his early morning work calls were disturbing my sleep and that the separation would be more considerate for both of us. But I could tell from the deliberate way he arranged his things and the finality with which he closed the door each evening that the move represented something more permanent than a temporary accommodation for work schedules. When I tried to engage him in conversations about our relationship or about the concerns he had raised regarding my friendship with Declan, he responded with brief statements that acknowledged my points without arguing against them, and his refusal to engage emotionally or intellectually felt like a rejection that was somehow more complete than anger or accusation would have been. I also noticed that Miles had begun spending time away from the apartment in the evenings and on weekends, leaving for several hours at a time without providing detailed explanations about where he was going or what he was doing. And when I asked him about his whereabouts, he would say simply that he had been out, or that he had needed to take care of some errands, and his vague responses frustrated me because they mirrored the same lack of transparency that he had accused me of demonstrating during my meetings with Declan. On several occasions, I heard him taking phone calls in the stairwell outside our apartment, speaking in low tones that I could not quite make out through the door. And when I pressed my ear against the gap, I caught fragments of words like documentation and timeline and we should organize by date. But when I confronted him later and asked who he had been speaking with, he told me calmly that it was a work call about a project review and that I did not need to concern myself with the details of his professional obligations. What I did not know during this period was that Miles had been meeting regularly with Simone Reeve, and that their initial collaboration on evidence gathering had evolved into something deeper and more emotionally significant, with conversations that moved beyond documentation of betrayal to discussions about healing, personal values, and the possibility of building new relationships based on honesty and mutual respect rather than intellectual posturing or manipulative justifications. They had created a shared timeline that organized all of their evidence into a coherent narrative, with color-coded entries showing hotel visits, streaming account activity, credit card charges, location data from both of our phones, text message references, and social media posts that demonstrated awareness and intent. And the document was precise and comprehensive and completely impossible to refute through rhetorical arguments or philosophical reframing. Simone had printed 2 copies of the master timeline and bound them in professional folders with labeled tabs, dividing the evidence into categories like financial records, digital activity, location data, public statements, and witness accounts, and she gave one folder to Miles while keeping the other for herself. And they sat together in her apartment living room, reviewing the documents one final time before the mediation session they had jointly scheduled through a licensed family therapist named Dr. Maren Cross. During one of their meetings at a park bench near the river, as the sun was setting and the light turned golden across the water, Simone mentioned that she had not expected to feel hopeful about anything in the aftermath of discovering Declan's affair, but that the friendship she had developed with Miles over the past several weeks had reminded her that honest communication and genuine emotional connection were possible between adults who valued transparency over game playing and manipulation. Miles admitted that he felt the same way, and that meeting her had helped him understand that the problems in his marriage were not the result of his own intellectual limitations or emotional inadequacy, but rather the consequence of choosing a partner who valued being right over being kind and who used intelligence as a weapon rather than as a tool for mutual understanding and growth. There was a moment of silence between them, and then Simone reached across the space separating them on the bench and took his hand, and he did not pull away, and they sat like that for several minutes, watching the river and the fading light. And the gesture felt more honest and meaningful than any of the elaborate philosophical discussions I had conducted with Declan in hotel rooms and co-working spaces over the previous months. Petra, Miles's sister, met Simone at a cafe one afternoon at Miles's invitation, and they talked for over an hour about the situation and about how Miles was coping with the dissolution of his marriage, and Petra asked careful questions about Simone's intentions and whether the relationship between her and Miles was something that had developed organically from shared pain or whether it represented a rebound reaction that might complicate the healing process. Simone was thoughtful and direct in her responses, explaining that neither she nor Miles had planned for their friendship to become something more, but that they had both been struck by how easy it was to communicate honestly with someone who valued the same things they did, and who had been through a similar experience of betrayal and gaslighting. And she assured Petra that they were both committed to handling the situation with integrity and transparency rather than using their relationship as a way to hurt their respective spouses or to avoid dealing with the emotional consequences of their marriages ending. Petra listened carefully, and at the end of the conversation, she told Simone that she had not seen her brother genuinely smile or seem at ease in over a year, and that whatever was developing between them seemed to be built on a foundation of mutual respect and kindness that his marriage to me had clearly been lacking. And she said that she supported them both and would be there if they needed anything during the difficult weeks ahead. 2 days before the scheduled mediation session, I received an email from Dr. Maren Cross's office with the session details and a note indicating that both parties and relevant witnesses would be present. And I assumed that the witnesses would be family members, or perhaps colleagues who could speak to the general state of our relationship. And I began preparing a speech in my mind about how Miles had been emotionally withdrawn and controlling, and how his inability to embrace a more evolved understanding of partnership had created the problems we were now facing. I did not realize that the relevant witnesses included Simone Reeve, or that she and Miles had been working together for weeks to organize evidence that would demonstrate not only my affair with Declan, but also the systematic pattern of manipulation and gaslighting I had used to justify my behavior and deflect responsibility. And I certainly did not anticipate that Miles would walk into the mediation session with Simone beside him, their connection visible in the quiet way they moved together and the shared understanding that had developed between them over the course of their collaboration. The mediation office waiting area had beige walls decorated with generic landscape paintings and a water cooler that hummed softly in the corner. And when I arrived at exactly 10 o'clock on the morning of April 14th, I expected to find Miles sitting alone, or perhaps accompanied by his sister Petra. But instead I saw him seated calmly in one of the chairs, with a thick folder resting on his lap. And beside him sat a woman I recognized from social media as Simone Reeve, Declan's wife. And across from them in another chair sat Declan himself, looking pale and uncomfortable and refusing to make eye contact with anyone in the room. My prepared speech about Miles's emotional rigidity and controlling behavior evaporated as I stood frozen in the doorway, trying to understand why Declan's wife was present and what her connection to Miles might be. And before I could formulate a question or an objection, Dr. Maren Cross appeared from an inner office and invited all four of us into the conference room with a calm professionalism that suggested she had been fully briefed on the situation and knew exactly what evidence was about to be presented. The conference room was small and windowless, lit by overhead fluorescent panels that cast everything in flat, neutral light, and the table between us was large enough to accommodate the folders and documents that Miles and Simone placed side by side in the center, their evidence arranged with tabs and labels that indicated months of careful organization and cross-referencing. Dr. Cross explained that this was a joint mediation session requested by both Mr. Finch and Mrs. Reeve, who had discovered that their respective spouses were involved in an affair that had been running concurrently for approximately 4 months. And she stated that the goal of today's session was to review the documented evidence, allow each party an opportunity to respond, and establish clear terms for separation and asset division moving forward.